Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to this webinar of the FS Club at 12:30 here in London. And I'm delighted to welcome an old colleague, Benoît Lallemand, who is joining us at 13:30 from Brussels. Today's topic is, I think, a fascinating one: magic money trees and the new private-public dynamic. And we're going to explore EU economic policy development with somebody who's really at the core of it. That's Benoît in his role as the Director General of Finance Watch. Now, you'll know me. I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien Group, and it really is a privilege to be able to introduce this session. Our webinars are only possible thanks to our sponsors. You can see here the vast range of sponsors, financial centers, technology companies, and financial firms. Basically, our sponsors allow us to range widely and freely across anything to do with technology, economics, and finance. And I think today's no exception. We've certainly heard over the years a lot of theories being propounded about fiscal policy, but we've now hit in the shape of COVID-19 following a financial crisis back in 2007, 8, 9, or I should probably say more accurately, financial crises, because there were several of them. We have seen, of course, the rise of a number of theories that say print with abandon, not least the ever popular monetary theory, which has adopted the close of an older theory, an Austrian theory, which at least has, in my opinion, a bit more basis than just print money. But people seem to have forgotten what was happening back at the tail end of the 19th century. Anyway.
Sorry, Michael, I don't think we've got slides yet.
Oh, my apologies. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much, Morgan. Great. My apologies there. I'll just flip back to our sponsors. May I say as well that my job today is to get out of your way so that you can actually listen to what Benoît has to say. As ever, we're going to have some time for discussion, and please use the GoToWebinar question facility, and I'll feed those into discussion with Benoît. Please don't email me. I'm here with you and Benoît, so I'll only catch those questions later. And we hope that we're going to have a really good session because I personally am very interested in this subject. Benoît, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Thanks for the invitation. And so, indeed, we have a very ambitious title for a very short presentation, so I'll do my best. What I'll do with you, if we move to the agenda, so next slide. In really a minute, I'll talk about Finance Watch, not just to do some self-promotion, but because our history relates with one of the last financial crisis and the last 10 years, which to some extent led also to the current situation. A quick point on the global perspective before we move to the EU response to the crisis in the short term, and then in the longer term, so what's happening now in Brussels, the discussions about the next 7 years EU budget, a fiscal and possibly taxation union on the cards, and then some perspectives and opening the debate. So that's what we'll be talking about in a minute. I think, Michael, we want to run a quick poll before we get going with the presentation.
That's right. Folks, Benoît thought it'd be interesting to get your views on, do you think that EU leaders know what they're doing? I'm launching the poll. Again, if you go to the GoToWebinar poll facility, you can answer it. We have people who are very fast on their fingers here, Benoît. Over 50% have already voted in 10 seconds. I'll give it just a few more seconds before I close the poll. Okay, and nearly everyone has voted, and I'm now about to show you the results. Ta-da! Well, a very balanced view there that 45% believe the EU leaders know what they're doing. Had we more time, I think we could probably spend a bit of time looking at the British view, given the heavy preponderance of British folks here, or given last night's election debate in America. It'd be interesting to range wider. But over to you, Benoît.
Thank you. It's probably a good result. It means we need this discussion. So just really quickly, so what is Finance Watch? We 10 years old. We are a child of the crisis, the financial crisis of 07, 08. You get the Pittsburgh summit in 09 and a big sort of re-regulation agenda. And at that point, there was an assessment in Brussels that there was no counterweight to the arguments of the financial lobby in the discussion around, how should we re-regulate the financial sector, and no public interest perspective. So that's how Finance Watch was created. We are two things really. We are membership associations. We have 110 members across 21 countries, trade unions, consumers, academia, think tanks, experts. So that's on the membership side. And then we also have a secretariat of 12 to 15 professionals based in Brussels who come from the financial sector, banks, insurance, asset management, with this idea that we need to know what we're talking about when we engage in financial policy discussions. Our motto is to make finance serve society. Sounds very ambitious. You can stay on the previous slide. We'll come back to that in a second. So what does making finance serve society mean? What we do really is, as I said, financial policy, financial regulation. So changing the rules of the game, where some others might want to change culture or business models. We look at the rules of the game, which is ultimately financial legislation. You can check our website and you'll see we cover a long list of topics: banking, insurance, fintech, sustainable finance, financial inclusion. So please join the debate. Next slide. So that's. I just wanted to go indeed to this dimension of the difference between that last crisis and today's crisis and where we've been. So I thought a good illustration of that is to show you two of our reports cover. One dates from 2012. It was the first report ever to end all crisis. Another one dates a few months back. It's called Nature's Return. It's much more about it's about a much more ambitious topic. And what I want to say here is that I think we've moved from a discussion 10 years ago about making finance and the financial system in general, but more specifically the private financial sector, not hurt society. So it was a really negative prudential perspective. And we now, even just before COVID and now with COVID, into a discussion of how can the financial system at large support the recovery, support the energy transition, a just transition, etc. So I think it's good to notice we know the debate is in a better place, I think, today. What hasn't changed is that, I have to share that with you from Brussels, the financial lobby, and again, we all come from the financial sector, so there's no good and evil here, but it's a pretty organized force in Brussels, and they haven't changed so much. So it's still a very deregulation push constantly, like it was 10 years ago. It's just the justifications or the excuse is different, but I think that's a bit too bad. Of course, there's a discussion about, last time it was their fault. It came from the financial sector. This time it comes from the real economy, from a health crisis. So it is quite different. And so again, on this debate, I think what's good now and wasn't the case 10 years ago is I think there's a sort of change of paradigm, at least on the tables. We don't know where it's going to be. Whereas I think, as I said 10 years ago, it was about fixing a few issues, getting rid of rotten apples. And then it's all going to be okay. And we missed an opportunity definitely 10 years ago to ask some of the tough questions. So I think today is an opportunity to go back to these tough questions, which is the bigger picture before we zoom into fiscal now about what is the financial system. It's not just financial markets. It is a necessary coordination between monetary, fiscal, taxation, prudential for the private sector, and also obviously environmental and social legislation, so also the role of government. So the fact we're having this discussion actually, I think, is welcome. We didn't have it 10 years ago. I think of course, it's a bit too bad a pandemic was necessary to get there, but so I think, that's what I had to say about the last crisis. Now, this idea that money grows on trees, also you can look at this slide. It's a flow view of central bank's balance sheets, including a projection from JP Morgan of the next 2 years. You see this massive wave, really, which is ongoing, which is a huge wave of increase of central bank's balance sheet. So, I think that puts the debate to rest. Yes, of course, money grows on trees, or it grows on a computer screen more accurately. That's what happens. And then we've been at it for 10 years, not in these proportions, as you see. If you go to the next slide, you then get what is a stock view. So we had a flow view. This is a stock view. It's not a wave anymore. It looks more like a mountain, but you get the same sort of perspective that indeed, and this one doesn't include Bank of China. That's why it's a bit, it's more in the 15 trillion and not the 20s. So again, we've been doing this for 10 years. This is not new with the pandemic. We've been talking about the new normal of this monetary expansion over the last years. Again, I think the good news is that if people accept it's there to stay, people also realize it hasn't worked over the last 10 years. So investment is not picking up, growth is not picking up. And so although it's clear it's here to stay, as I said, I think the question now on the table is how to make it work. And again, I think that's positive. We don't see the responses to that yet, but I think that's a healthy debate. If you move to next slide, there is this discussion though now about this monetary expansion and you know, what's going on here. Is it and it links to fiscal policy, which we'll discuss in a second. Is this the rise of a new pervasive state? Is that very negative? I think if you look at this slide, and which shows a strong correlation between central banks' asset purchases and stock prices, basically, you see, I think we have a problem of moral hazard, I think, to put it bluntly, in which we see now with, you know, basically saving yesterday's economy at all costs and with all distinctions between the actors. I think what's happened is that markets, financial markets, as we see on the screen, have become sort of too big to let down or too big to fail. So you remember Lagarde, when she took office, had this famous remark that she wasn't there to close the spread, and there was a massive backlash. In fact, she had to quickly apologize and realize that yes, a big part of her mandate is to, you know, keep stock and asset prices up. I think that comes to this realization that indeed it's become a big part of central bank's mandate, and it really shouldn't be. This is what we see here on the screen is the institutionalization of moral hazard, where you have a privatization of gains when things go well, and then a socialization of losses when things turn sour, as it is the case now with the pandemic. So you could say that's unfair, that's one way to look at it, but it's also, it sets the wrong incentives in the economy, where you would actually need some of that creative destruction mechanism, and of course this kills it. There is no creative destruction anymore. When you're in trouble, you're going to be saved by the central bank or by the government, but you don't need to care about being effective. So this would go a long way in undermining trust in both markets and the state. So I think we see this sort of hybrids going up, where it's not a market economy anymore because you don't have market discipline, as I just explained. It's not quite a state control or state-run economy where you do have some control over the direction, because you don't really have that yet. So we're a bit in the middle, and that's not a good thing. So I think we need a healthy debate about where we go. Let's move to next slide, which is just to show that there's no region in the world which is exempt from the economic and the financial journey we've been on for the last 10 years, really. Everyone was the same boat. And so we're going to discuss the EU in a second, but we would really need a global response, I think, which we had much more, by the way, 10 years ago. You know, some things were not in the cards 10 years ago, but actually the G20 was alive and well. I mentioned the Pittsburgh summit in 2009. You had an important global momentum, consensus about the need to coordinate things at global level. Yeah, and I guess we remember this with some nostalgia, because as this graph shows, of course it does matter what the EU does, what the US does, what the UK does, China does, but more importantly, we need a coordinated response, which we don't have today. So, but anyway, we'll now focus on the EU. Next slide, please. I thought I'd use this picture. Well, yeah, probably indeed back on the depressive US presidential debate of yesterday, or probably not a debate, I don't know how you call it. And so indeed what we see here is that in the EU, the three most powerful institutions are led by these three women. So you get an ECB, obviously, European Commission, and also the European Council. Merkel is not just the Chancellor of Germany, Germany also holds the presidency of the Council for now. And so, yeah, I thought that's just good news in itself. We're probably not in such a bad place, as I said earlier, relatively speaking, even if what I'm going to say now is we need to do much more and nothing's solved. But I thought this picture is really a contrast with what we saw yesterday in the US and possibly what some of you guys see in the UK. Next slide.
The BBC called it a food fight last night, which I think was pretty accurate.
It was more like that, yeah. And again, you know, this quite a different level in the EU. Whether you like what's being done or not, it's still pretty decent and educated. So indeed, next slide. What you see on this slide is really the immediate response. So it's like an April snapshot of what happened immediately after the pandemic hits and everyone went to lockdown. So I'm not going to run through all of that. It's basically the EU put all available resources from the EU budget available to member states. That happened quite quickly. But also there was a relaxation of the fiscal rules and state aid rules, which, as you know, are quite strict at European level. So, member states being forced to keep their public debt and government deficits under control, but also tight competition rules which forbid state aid. The EU showed quite a lot of flexibility immediately to basically lift the fiscal rules, as we call them, so the famous 3 and 60%, which won't be back before 2022. That's important to know. But also the state aid rules. So they basically let governments do what they needed to do. So that has to be done. You see the amounts there. They're pretty decent. I think this had to be done. What I do want to mention about the fiscal rules, so the famous 3 and 60% and the whole fiscal coordination mechanism in the EU, is that it was planned before COVID there would be a review of the economic governance, which including a public debate. That's been postponed. It was supposed to take place this year. So next year there will be a very important political debate about reviewing the fiscal rules and the EU economic governance, which comes at the right time, I think. And so we'll be going back to these discussions about monetary expansion, fiscal expansion, how that's governed, etc. So yeah, take notice that there will be this very important debate next year. Next slide, where you see basically the longer term response that the EU has discussed the last few weeks, so which includes the 21-27 EU budget. And so I'm not going to go into the monetary response and the details of that. You see the amounts are pretty similar. So we're in the range of 1.3 trillion euros, which is not enough, but it's a pretty good start. And this doesn't include the national budgets, the use of the national budgets by member states, which brings us to much higher figures. Something that happened when the heads of states met in July, as you all know, is the decision for the EU to borrow money on markets. As the EU, you probably heard about the debates between, let's say the Netherlands and what's been called the Frugal Four, and some others who pushed for this common borrowing, which brings the cost of borrowing down for some of the member states like Italy and Spain. That was a major step, as hopefully you've heard, and a step in the right direction, showing some solidarity between the North and the South. Some argue that it was going to be this or the beginning of fragmentation of the Eurozone, or possibly a breakup of the Eurozone. So I'll come back to that, but I think it was a big decision in the life of the EU to, it sets a precedent, basically, that Brussels can, member states can borrow money together. Next slide. So we just had a picture of monetary and fiscal responses to the crisis. So basically ECB in Europe. That's a zoom on monetary. I'm not going to go into details of what the ECB has deployed its capacity over the last few months, and it has planned for the next 2 years. So yeah, as you see again, it's quite a mountain. So there's as Michael said, we better have a big discussion about how this monetary expansion works or hasn't worked over the last 10 years, and because it's going to keep going up, is that healthy or not? Again, what are the governance mechanisms? How do we make it work? But I won't go into details of what Christine Lagarde and her colleagues have decided. If you move to next slide, then it's moving from monetary to fiscal. This just gives an order of magnitude of the fiscal response in the US, Japan. Then you see the European Commission and its own borrowing, Germany, UK, Italy, France. You see there that the order of magnitude are pretty similar. So in terms of the size, governments are reacting. They're taking action. It's many economists say it's still too low in sort of percentage of GDP as an intervention to ensure there's a rebound, but we go in the right direction. So that was just an order of magnitude. Now, if you go to next slide, it's just an illustration that this, as much as this is a short-term response to COVID, this was actually necessary. Yeah. So this fiscal expansion we see, some will argue, and you see what you see on this slide is basically the level of public investment and how it's been going down since the 60s gradually. And in the UK, actually, on the right hand, you see that there was just a big slash in public investment from the 70s onwards. So then it stayed pretty stable. The decrease is more gradual in other parts of the world. And if you move to next slide, you see what effect that has in specific areas, including infrastructure, housing, education, health, urban transport. What you see in red is where there's an under provision of infrastructure by country and by sector, and that's a direct result of the lack of public investment, which is something that has been going on for, as we see on the previous graphs, for the last decades, and increasing over the last 10 years as a result of the financial crisis, increased public debt, and then austerity as a response. This is not good, not just for the people, but for the economy as a whole. So I would argue that what's happening now, the fiscal expansion, is something that was needed anyway. So hopefully it's there to last. If you move to next slide, then it's some information for you in terms of the details of what the EU has agreed. So the quick response is integrated into a longer-term response, which is the 21-27 EU budget called the multi-annual financial framework. What you see there is that there's about 750 billion for the next generation EU, which is this budget that's been agreed in July and which is debated hotly every day here in Brussels. If you move to next slide, in terms of how this money will be allocated and then how it's going to be spent. So in terms of the allocation, what you see is that you have, more or less half grants and half loans. We focus here on the grants. This is again very important. It was hotly debated in July. There will be grants, yeah. So part of the common Commission borrowing by the EU Commission on financial markets will actually be donated to member states for some part. Of course, these member states will have to explain what they're going to do with the money, but this is not a loan. So this was quite a massive step that some countries like the Netherlands were not very happy with, which goes a long way to show the beginning of European solidarity. So what you see there is the keys of the allocation of the amounts, and which countries like Italy and Spain are going to benefit more generously from. And you see that for the immediate release of the funds, so 21-22, the unemployment over 2015 and 2019 will be a key, which is again a very good sign, because it looks at the health of the economies before the crisis as a criteria for allocating the money. On the right-hand side of the screen, what you see is that in the longer term, of course, the impact of COVID, the drop in real GDP in 2020 and 2020, 2021 in the different countries will be used as a key to channel the money to this or that country. So that's who's going to benefit. Then if you move to next slide, it's about how the money should be used. So there's an intense policy debate about basically the conditionality of the release of the funds, because it won't be released at once, and of course the Commission will be asking for basically, as they should, substantial evidence that the money is going to be spent wisely. And then we go back to the fact that actually, to be fair, the EU before COVID, so that's late last year, and with the new Commission and von der Leyen taking the presidency of the Commission, you've all heard about this EU Green Deal as a key policy initiative, the just green digital transformation of the economy. I mean, that wasn't the card before COVID came, and so it's still in the card today, which I think is again quite exceptional. If you look at the global discussion here in Brussels, this idea of a Green Deal is not seen as some radical, crazy idea from the left. Of course, not everyone is happy with that, so I'm not saying there's a consensus, but it will be part of how the Commission looks at the way member states will spend this recovery money, and the Commission will actually insist that there is sufficient consideration to long-term growth perspective, including environmental sustainability, social sustainability, which, as we see with COVID, which relates to some extent with the destruction of our ecosystems, one doesn't go without the other. So I think that brings a pretty healthy discussion about getting rid of GDP as the only indicator you need to take into account when you do fiscal expansion or monetary expansion. If you go to next slide, that's just a quick one to show you that even the beginning of a taxation union, there's still as you know, there's a monetary union. Obviously, fiscal union is still not there. Obviously, we have 27 budgets and fiscal activities, but there's increased coordination, as we just discussed, and coordination is the word, and trying to have an alignment in terms of the political goals of this fiscal expansion. Here you see that there's the beginning of the same process on taxation. So basically, the EU has agreed that part of the way the money is going to be reimbursed to markets will be new taxes at EU level, like a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a digital levy, an improved ETS and stuff like that. So that's again quite interesting in terms of the dynamic of questioning the alignment or not of taxation systems in 27 member states. It's a big debate. There's a lot of competition between member states on taxation, including quite a strange role played by the Netherlands, who claims they're part of the frugal orthodox four, when actually, as you probably know, they're not quite playing a fair game with taxation. Moving then to I think the last substantial slide, where what you see here is part of an index run by Vivid Economics, where they look at not just the amount of the fiscal expansion, but the greenness of these stimulus plans, includes the G20 and Spain. You see that if you start from the right-hand side, the EU, France, but also the UK and Germany do pretty well in terms. And this is about this big debate of where the money goes, and do we go for a sort of recovery and just basically maintaining alive yesterday's economy, which sometimes seems to be the direction of travel, because it's like you have to save yesterday's economy, otherwise it'll go down. And the fact that you need to use this moment for transformation, and also because of the expansion of government balance sheets, central bank's balance sheet, and just the scale of that, you see people, including I think was the chair of the International Energy Agency, saying, watch out, if you're going to spend these trillions the old way, or just saving yesterday's economy in terms of environmental damage, carbon emission lock-in, etc., you're in a bad place, which also will play a role into the long-term resilience of these economies. So I think this, and again, that's a healthy debate happening in Brussels, sort of recovery versus resilience. To be provocative, it's again, do you want to maintain a zombie economy alive, or do you want to use this moment to accept there'll be losers, gradually let down of a fossil fuel economy, and embrace sort of green and digital transformation? That is a discussion. Of course, there's a big discussion about job losses and which sectors are going to take these job losses, and you see politicians quite wary of these job losses and the electorate being unhappy. But the discussion is there, and I think we just can't afford not to have it, and just to, as I said, maintain yesterday's economy alive at all costs, just because it won't work economically. Even from a prudential fiscal perspective, this will hit back at us and force much more massive spending in the future. So this is I think whether you're conservative or more progressive, this idea of the energy transition, the social transition, and using this moment to have a more mature discussion about the course of the economy has to take place, and that is something that's being debated in Brussels today. I think there was quite a lot of information and quite an overview of the discussions taking place in Brussels. So Michael, I think it'd be good to now move and see where people are at in terms of the discussions they like to dive in. I think we want to take another poll before I just make a very short conclusion, and then I think we want to open the debate.
That's absolutely fantastic, Benoit. I've just launched the poll, so folks, if you can get your votes in. Wow. Wow. Okay, well, let me close this one and share the results with everybody. My gosh, 83%. I guess they're looking at your mountains, Benoit, and saying that these are mountains that need to be bashed down. So that's at least how I might interpret it. But let me hand back to you for some. Sorry.
That they do.
83% would like the return of resolute directional fiscal policy. Let me just re-show you that again. Sorry, I went too quickly.
Yeah.
So 83% on that one. Fantastic. So let me just hand you back. Yeah.
So just to conclude, I think that's interesting though, because I'm quite sure your audience is mixed and probably more expert than political, really. So it proves that technically we see these mountains, as you said, they can't go down for many reasons. So I think then, and that'll be my conclusion. And the good news that at EU level, this discussion will take place next year about the economic governance and how this coordination between, the role of the government, fiscal, prudential, monetary, really, frankly, to use big words, a discussion about the social contract and how we manage it in the next decades will take place, and really moving from a discussion about the firefighting, which took place this year and had to take place. We had to save the economy, save jobs, manage the health crisis. So moving from the firefighters to more of the architects and discussing in the coming weeks and months and also next year about the articulation between, as I said, monetary, fiscal, prudential, the world of private finance, the world of public finance. That's a discussion we didn't have after the last financial crisis, although it was a discussion to be had. It wasn't just because of the bad financial sector that there was a crisis 10 years ago. Of course, monetary and lax monetary policy was one of the causes of the last crisis. And so I think the discussion we didn't have 10 years ago, we're having it now. I think that's very positive. In the US, we're not quite there yet, as we saw yesterday, unfortunately. But I think on the continent and in the UK, we're having this more adult discussion. The Bank of England is taking massive steps, the Treasury as well. And so I think this is good, and we need to discuss this. I think the result of the poll shows that there is this maturity that, this is not going to go away. But then you can't just say that. You can't just say, okay, we're going to print money forever and go into public debt. We need to see how we manage that. And I think that's the exciting discussion we're going to have. So I'd open the debate on that.
Oh, Benoît, that's absolutely fantastic, and actually quite a few points for discussion. Just a quick one. Could you elaborate a little bit more, please, for the audience on what is the exact title of this discussion? Who's it reporting into, and what are the results intended to achieve, and maybe also some idea of time scale?
So there's a short-term discussion around what's called the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is the famous 750 billion euros that the Commission is going to raise on markets as an institution. So how that's going to be spent, what's the governance of that? That's a short-term discussion that'll be concluded by the end of this year. Yeah, so the Parliament, the Commission, the Council are heavily involved here, and basically how the Commission is going to check on member states that they spend that money properly and so on. So that's short term, before the end of the year. The next longer term discussion will, and they'll also vote, there'll also be a vote in December on the 21-27 budget of the EU, which is around 2 trillion, including the 750 billion. So that's a hot discussion. That sort of preempts to some extent the more heavy discussion, which is called the review of the European economic governance, which is really looking at how we coordinate fiscal policies and taxation policies between member states, also about the famous fiscal rules, the 3% limit on budget deficits and 60% limit on public debt. That's going to be an open debate next year to basically decide if these fiscal rules come back, because they've been relaxed. So member states are now allowed to spend way beyond these thresholds, and the discussion will be exactly what we've been discussing for about half an hour, which is if these rules don't come back, how do we manage that fiscal and monetary expansion? How do we spend the money? And so that's called the review of the EU economic governance. That's a debate that's been announced next year, and so I'll keep you informed, obviously. And that should be wrapped up by the end of 21.
Now, you had a lot of really good slides, but a number of people in the audience were particularly taken by this one, myself included, I might add. Hugh Purser says, could we have a moment explaining this in just a little bit more detail? It looks a grim picture. Any comments you'd like to raise on this? Because
no, I mean, just swiftly, and we can put that online, that it's an academic study on public investment in the EU over the last decades. And this one zooms in on indeed what they call the under-provision of infrastructure, which relates to a large extent to the decreased public investment. Just shows sector by sector, ICT, environment, housing, education, health, the sort of investment gap, if you like, and how. I mean, frankly, I don't think this is surprising, especially when you discuss about the health crisis and the state of the health systems throughout Europe. Really, some states like Germany. Where actually in public investment had remained at a much more decent level over the past decades. And so you see that if you zoom in just on health, your whole economy and in public infrastructure is a much better place to respond to crisis when they've been invested in sufficiently. So that's what I take from this graph, is that basically the fiscal expansion going on today is good, but what you want to do now for the future is do basically a proactive, prevent future crisis, make sure your health systems are geared up for potential next health crisis. Your education system is at the right level, so people are trained for tomorrow's economy, and you want to do that, preemptively rather than reactively. I think that's the lesson I take from this slide. But
yeah, I've been actually quite impressed. I mean, one of the things I noticed just this very month was that the ECB is now accepting sustainability-linked bonds as collateral, or sustainability-linked loans, which is it's that kind of quiet underpinning of this strategy of green, without sort of necessarily it all just being about the money being spent. It's also about how useful it is and how it can be deployed. And I'm frankly quite impressed with some of this. We've got a few tough questions here, so don't feel you have to answer them all. But I'll start with one from Matthew Leach. What difference would it have made if almost everyone who was employed was doing an essential job rather than a job that could be stopped for a few months?
What difference would have it made? I think the underlying point here is that if we managed to stop the economy, it was because most of the activities are just not very necessary. Did I get that question right? And what difference would it have made? I mean, all I can say, and I mean, you know, I'm biased. I mean, we're on the public interest side, and we like a different type of economy. I think that the response relates to the slide we just saw before. Indeed, if some of these sectors, like the health sector, education, and many others, infrastructure, you know, training workers actually to move from one sector like fossil fuels to another, which is more of a renewable energy, I think that would create a lot of jobs, and a lot of these jobs would be necessary. So I think that's a good difference. But I think it would also prevent such crises, frankly, in terms of anticipating health crisis. You know, you read reports that the discussion around a pandemic has been pretty hot from the WHO and others for 2 or 3 decades. You know, so some of us look surprised, but they saw it coming, and we didn't prepare. So, so I guess my response is, if you had more useful jobs, the good news is you would always have less of these crises, and so less of a suspension of like unuseful economic activity. That's a big question, so that's all I can do, I'm afraid, for that.
It is a big question, but thanks for tackling it. There's a couple of comments here. Anthony Abel is asking, do you see the unit of account moving away from central bank control? Keith Robertson is kind of curious, are we moving towards a point where there must be a profound reappraisal of the philosophical and economic foundations of fiat money? I mean, you and I are both aware that there's a tremendous amount of discussion about central bank digital currencies, but any comments do you foresee as part of perhaps this discussion next year, a lot more discussion where we're perhaps taking away some of the money creation facilities of commercial banks?
I mean, hopefully that's what I can say. I mean, you know, Michael, feel free to pick up on that one on fiat currency. But I think I made that point that I think we need to have these tough discussions anyway, because monetary expansion and fiscal expansion is here to stay. And really, my assessment of where the EU stand, you see that on that last slide actually, is in July when the Netherlands and others and really some leadership by Merkel, you have to give that to her, to go for collective borrowing on financial markets from the EU and grants, I mean massive grants in the tens of billions of euros to Italy, to Spain, and the expansion of fiscal and monetary capacity shows that we've made a step in a sort of change direction and change of paradigm direction. It's only one step, and there is resistance, and you're going to have elections in Germany next year, in France the following year. So that's all fragile. And so my point is, I think we're heading for these tough discussions, which in itself is a good news. Now, how much political courage there'll be in the Netherlands, in Germany, in France, to pursue these discussions and maintain EU cohesion, that's up for grabs. But I think there's everything to win. So I'm quite optimistic in that sense. Again, you know, look at what's happening in the US or other regions of the world. There's still a big risk that this political will is fragile, too much fragile, and people don't dare to go into these discussions, talk about fiat currency and so on. Let's be honest, you know, these are not daily discussions in Brussels. It's more for, you know, experts probably in the audience of this webinar, people like you, Michael, academia. It's not quite trickled down to politicians quite yet. And so let's see, but hopefully they have the political courage to go there next year, because yeah, we need to crack these nuts. And let's face it, you know, there's still a big risk that this all goes down in a negative direction, which I think Brexit was one of the first signs of, where if they don't maintain this will of cohesion, of course there's a negative path that is almost more easy, which is fragmentation, which is the rise of, you know, national populism in different member states. And we're not there. We're heading in the opposite direction now, and that's positive. It's fragile, but it's positive.
Yeah, just following that track for another minute, Stephen Murgatroyd is curious, do you think we will see a large divergence in recovery strategy and finance between the EU and the UK?
Between the EU and the UK? No, probably not, because economically it doesn't make sense. I mean, you have competition, let's face it. I mean, this whole debate now about the terms of Brexit is also about competing economies. But you know, and I mean, one doesn't go without the other, so I don't think they can fundamentally diverge now. I don't think so.
Kirshen Ahmed makes a long comment and a really interesting one, I think. He's looking at the sort of the green stimulus element. Great slide. The elephant in the room is the north-south divide. Countries that manufacture goods have a negative contribution. The consumption-oriented countries, who are actually in some ways the drivers of pollution, do not look at their consumption habits. So are we going to see a stronger north-south divide over things like frugality?
I mean, I fully agree with that comment. There's a lot of hypocrisy about some of the northern states being very proud about low levels of CO2 emissions, and that's easy for them. So no, I fully agree, and it needs to be part of the discussion going ahead of who bears the costs of the energy transition, and make sure there's a really added discussion here, which I think this comment alludes to. And we haven't discussed this, but the social dimension is very strong. And the reason why governments jump to the rescue of Air France or KLM or whatever other fossil fuel driven sector is because they need to save jobs. And in fact, trade unions have been quite hesitant to support green conditionality to the bailouts in fear that there would be massive layouts. So I think, and François should be releasing a note later this week recommending you should do whatever it takes for social social cohesion and basically saving jobs. So which doesn't mean saving jobs at all costs and rescuing Air France, which means making sure workers can transition, have no decrease in earnings, more like a sort of transition fund or transition allowance to make sure precisely these guys are not the losers of the transition to a more sustainable economy.
Now, only time for a few more, but over the years, we've seen every time we've looked at debt mountains increasing or debt clocks that look at the scale of national debt, there have been a lot of naysayers, doom mongers. For years, the gold bugs have said this is all going to go to hell in a handbasket, and that's why you should hold gold. When QE started, we had strong predictions of inflation. I must say I fell into that camp. I felt that QE would ultimately lead to some form of inflation, but we seem to be fighting to get inflation back in. How would you assess the risks that we're in danger of finally cracking inflation, having a loss of confidence, and being unable to fund these stimulus points?
I think inflation is it's an explicit objective, obviously, of central banks, and they've been struggling. So I think I don't see inflation as being a risk in the short term, to be really honest. So now in terms of managing this, and what you allude to is this graph I showed about basically stock prices having been maintained by central bank intervention over the last 10 years, and the risk that all collapses. That's yes, there's a realization on markets that stock prices are disconnected from actual growth and growth potential, and that's part of the big discussion we need to have next year. How we basically need a plan for a soft landing. Let's be honest, because otherwise it is going to be a crash. And so again, it's a question of who's going to lose from that crash, and if we can make it soft. But I agree, yeah, markets are way too high, and so. Yeah, look, it's part of the big discussion we need to be having in the coming weeks. But inflation, I don't think, should be a big concern at this stage.
Okay. Benoît, just sort of a final area for you to comment upon, if you wouldn't mind. It's sadly we're running out of time. I'm getting a lot of warm thanks for the discussion. But there's been a lot of mothballing going on to some degree after the financial crisis, 2007, 8, 9. We just sort of mothballed everything. And you indicated that you had felt that whilst the debate had moved forward in many ways, the financial services lobby, which is very strong, seemed a little bit retrograde, a little bit buried in the past. And we also seem to be creating a set of zombie companies. I've always been curious about this. Are we in fact in Europe making a bit of a mistake by funneling so much of our packaging through the companies and maybe not direct to the individuals as happened in America? Do you feel that that's something we ought to be looking at? Because this Schumpeterian dynamic seems to be lacking.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And so individuals or governments, frankly, I mean, I know the Bank of England did that for a short time, basically funding the treasury directly and not via markets. So whether you go to individuals or governments, you know, if you didn't have inflation by throwing, you know, loads of liquidity on financial markets for the last 10 years, surely you won't get it if you go directly to individuals or governments. You know, in fact, you have a better chance of seeing investment, of seeing, you know, growth come back. So I think you're right, and that's still not happening. As I said, we can only hope this debates you know, take place in the coming weeks. But I think you're right, and it's a pity that that's something positive that happened in the US, I guess, that you just highlighted. That more should go to individuals and possibly governments as well, and not just financial firms or shareholders.
Well, Benoît, I'm afraid we do run out of time, and that was absolutely superb. Exactly what I wanted. I'd love to have more time on modern monetary theory and some other things, but you covered a heck of a lot of ground. So thank you. I've got 3 quick thanks to give. The first, as ever, is to our sponsors. I hope that all of you out there have found this interesting. We've got people ranging from the Estates and Infrastructure Exchange, which I think would have been challenged by your slide, to a number of IT firms who are very interested in seeing how we can move into a tradable green economy. So a lot of people out there who should be interested, and I'm sure are. Just a quick look ahead for those in the audience as to the webinars forthcoming. I give you a hearty recommendation to attend tomorrow's at 2 o'clock, a subject that's been deep in my brain for ages. What can the religions of the book actually teach us about finance? We're going to be taking an anthropological view of the Old Testament, and I would really encourage you to come. We've got a fascinating Islamic scholar giving us the whys and wherefores of the Abrahamic origins of finance. But the person I'd really like to thank most of all is Benoît. Benoît had arranged this originally. He's an old colleague of ours because we worked together on the Global Green Finance Index under many editions. We've always enjoyed working with Finance Watch, which is kind of fun to watch an NGO working with a commercial firm, and it's gone swimmingly well. Benoît's got some really keen insights, and it's so kind of him to share them with us today. Unfortunately, Benoît, in these days of COVID-19, I'm unable to open the doors and let everyone applaud, but I have brought my karmic Korean clapper here, and I will thank you profusely on behalf of the audience.
Michael.
And we would really love to have you back next year, particularly if this discussion gets into full swing. You seem to think it's very important, and it certainly sounds very important to me.
I'll be delighted. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.